In the winter of 1913, a quiet order moved through the distribution networks of American pharmaceutical supply. No congressional vote, no public announcement, no debate in the newspapers, just a series of internal memos circulated among the licensing boards of 14 states, followed by a gradual disappearance of a single plant from the shelves of every licensed pharmacy, apothecary, and general medical supplier in the country. The plant was called Lobelia. It had been used by healers on this continent for longer than any written record could confirm. It had been prescribed by physicians, sold over counters, packed into tinctures, dried into powders, and compounded into formulas by practitioners across every state in the Union. And then, within the span of roughly 18 months, it was gone. Not banned with fanfare, not condemned in a landmark case, just quietly, efficiently, and completely removed from the legitimate medical economy of the United States. The official story says Lobelia was dangerous. It says the plant caused nausea and respiratory depression, and that the new regulatory frameworks of the progressive era simply demanded higher standards of safety. That story is thin. It does not explain the timing. It does not explain who lobbied for the removal. It does not explain what replaced Lobelia in the formularies of American medicine in the years that followed. And it does not explain why the same plant continued to be used with remarkable results in countries that were not subject to American regulatory authority. If you want to understand what really happened to Lobelia, you have to go back much further than 1913. You have to go back to a time when the medical knowledge of this continent was not organized around pharmaceutical patents and licensing boards, but around something older, something that the official history of American medicine has spent more than a century trying to erase. If this is the kind of history that never makes it into the textbooks, subscribe to this channel. We cover the buried record of American medicine, the suppressed technologies of the 19th century, and the economic war that was fought, and mostly won, against the healing traditions of the old world that was replaced. Samuel Thompson was born in New Hampshire in 1769, and he grew up learning plants from a woman named Widow Benton, a local herbalist who recognized something in the boy that formal education would never have known how to cultivate. By the time Thompson was a young adult, he had developed a system of botanical medicine centered on a principle so simple that academic physicians dismissed it immediately, which is often what academic physicians do when a principle threatens their income. Thompson believed that all disease was caused by cold, and that the restoration of heat to the body was the restoration of health. His primary tool was Lobelia inflata, a wildflower native to eastern North America, with small blue flowers and inflated seed pods, growing in disturbed soils along roadsides and field edges from Nova Scotia to Georgia. Thompson had discovered, or perhaps more accurately, had learned from observation and from the older oral traditions around him, that Lobelia in small doses acted as a stimulant and expectorant, loosening obstruction and opening the airways. In larger doses it caused vomiting, which Thompson considered a purge, a clearing of the system that allowed heat to circulate again. He combined Lobelia with steam baths, cayenne preparations, and other botanical compounds, and he sold his system to ordinary Americans in the form of a pamphlet and a licensing arrangement that allowed anyone who purchased the rights to practice Thompsonian medicine on themselves and their families. The medical establishment of the early 19th century reacted with a fury that tells you everything you need to know about what was really at stake. Thompson was prosecuted for murder in 1809 after a patient died following Lobelia treatment. He was acquitted. He was prosecuted again on similar charges in subsequent years and acquitted again. The academic physicians of New England wrote pamphlets calling him a quack and a murderer. They called Lobelia a violent poison. They drafted petitions to state legislatures demanding that botanical medicine be criminalized and that the practice of medicine be restricted to men with academic degrees. Thompson responded by selling more than 100,000 copies of his guide and building a network of botanical practitioners that, by the 1830s, numbered in the hundreds of thousands across the country. At its peak, the Thompsonian movement may have represented the medical preferences of as much as 1/3 of the American population. This was not a fringe movement. This was a mass rejection of academic medicine by ordinary people who had tried both systems and made a choice. The choice was not irrational. Academic medicine in the early 19th century was extraordinarily dangerous by any honest assessment. The bloodletting practiced by trained physicians killed patients at rates that botanical practitioners did not approach. Calomel, the mercury compound used by academic physicians as a standard remedy for almost everything, caused permanent nerve damage, tooth loss, and death. When ordinary Americans chose a Thompsonian practitioner over a university-trained physician, they were often making the safer choice, not because botanical medicine was perfect, but because the alternative was mercury poisoning and unnecessary bloodletting. Thompson died in 1843, but the movement he had built fractured and transformed in the years after his death. A faction of his followers, more academically inclined and more willing to engage with the developing science of chemistry, broke away to found what they called eclectic medicine. The eclectic physicians maintained the core botanical orientation of Thompson's system, but added systematic study, laboratory analysis, and a more rigorous approach to dosing and preparation. They founded medical schools, published journals, and developed a pharmacopoeia of botanical remedies that represented the most sophisticated synthesis of traditional plant knowledge and emerging scientific method that American medicine had ever produced. The Eclectic Medical College in Cincinnati was the center of this tradition, and at its peak, the Eclectic School was graduating physicians who could speak the language of both laboratory chemistry and centuries of empirical botanical practice. Lobelia remained central to the eclectic pharmacopoeia. It was studied, refined, prepared in standardized tinctures and extracts, and used by trained physicians across the country for respiratory conditions, asthma, croup, and a range of systemic complaints. The story of what happened to eclectic medicine, and to Lobelia along with it, cannot be understood without understanding what was happening to American capitalism in the same period. The decades after the Civil War were the decades in which the industrial fortunes that would define the 20th century were being assembled. Rockefeller and oil, Carnegie and steel, Mellon and banking. These men were not merely accumulating money. They were accumulating the capacity to shape the institutional structures of American life, to decide which professions would be organized in which ways, which bodies of knowledge would receive the blessing of official recognition, and which would be pushed to the margins. In 1901, John D. Rockefeller established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City, the first institution of its kind in the United States. The explicit mission of the institute was to bring American medicine in line with the laboratory-based model that had developed in Germany, a model centered on germ theory, synthetic chemistry, and the pharmaceutical products that could be derived from petroleum-based compounds. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented institutional history of American medicine. The Rockefeller interests, in combination with the Carnegie Foundation, commissioned a survey of American medical education that was published in 1910 under the name of its lead author, Abraham Flexner. The Flexner Report examined every medical school in the United States and Canada and graded them according to their adherence to the German laboratory model. Schools that did not have laboratory facilities, full-time faculty, and a curriculum centered on chemistry and bacteriology received failing grades. Schools that received failing grades lost their accreditation. Schools that lost their accreditation closed. The Eclectic Medical College in Cincinnati closed in 1909, but it had been dying for decades before that, squeezed by the loss of accreditation, the withdrawal of students, and the systematic defunding of any educational institution that did not conform to the Rockefeller model. The homeopathic schools closed. The osteopathic schools were forced to abandon their founding principles or close. The botanical tradition that had represented 1/3 of American medical practice in the 1830s was reduced within 2 generations to a marginalized remnant practiced by people the official medical establishment had successfully labeled as quacks. This did not happen because the botanical tradition was proven wrong. It happened because the botanical tradition was incompatible with the business model that the Rockefeller interests were building, a model in which medicine would be organized around patentable synthetic compounds manufactured by chemical corporations and prescribed by physicians trained in institutions that those same corporations funded. Lobelia could not be patented. It grew wild across half the continent. Any person with the knowledge to prepare it correctly could use it without purchasing anything from anyone. It was, in the language of the emerging pharmaceutical economy, a product that could not generate returns. And so it had to go, not through an honest debate about its efficacy, not through a series of controlled trials that demonstrated its dangers relative to the synthetic alternatives replacing it, just through the quiet machinery of licensing, accreditation, and regulatory capture that the Rockefeller model had installed at every choke point of American medical practice. The timing of 1913 is not coincidental. The Federal Reserve Act was signed in December of that year, completing the reorganization of American monetary policy under private banking interests. The same year, the 16th Amendment established the federal income tax, creating a revenue stream that would fund the expanding regulatory apparatus of the federal government. The regulatory machinery that removed lobelia from American pharmacies was not assembled by public servants acting in the public interest. It was assembled by the same network of foundation funding, academic influence, and legislative lobbying that was simultaneously reorganizing American banking, American industry, and American education. The removal of lobelia was one small piece of a much larger operation, replacing a decentralized, locally sourced, practitioner-driven medical economy with a centralized, corporation-dependent, patent-protected pharmaceutical industry. But the story goes deeper than Rockefeller. It goes deeper than the Flexner Report, because the medical tradition that Samuel Thompson was drawing on, the tradition of botanical medicine rooted in the knowledge of this continent's plants, did not originate only with the Native American tribes that European settlers encountered. The deeper you look at the botanical knowledge embedded in traditions like Thompson's, the more clearly you can see the outline of something older, something systematic, something that understood the chemistry of plants with a precision that empirical folk knowledge alone cannot explain. The lobeline alkaloids in lobelia inflate or bind to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors in the nervous system. They modulate dopamine transmission. They produce bronchodilation through mechanisms that pharmacologists did not fully characterize until the 20th century. A purely empirical tradition, developing knowledge through trial and error over centuries, would eventually arrive at the observation that lobelia helps breathing and clears obstruction. But the precision of the traditional dosing guidelines, the specific combinations with other botanical compounds, the timing of administration relative to meals and other treatments, these suggest a body of knowledge that was not assembled through observation alone. The specificity matches what you would expect from a tradition that had access to systematic study, to written records of accumulated experiment, to something resembling a formal pharmacy. This does not mean the Native American oral traditions that preserved fragments of this knowledge were unsophisticated. It means they were preserving something even older than themselves, fragments of a pharmacological tradition that predated the disruption of North American civilization by whatever happened in the period the official record calls the early 19th century. The mudflood researchers and the Tartaria historians who have been piecing together the evidence of the advanced civilization that occupied this continent before the one we are told about have focused primarily on architecture and technology. The star forts, the World's Fair buildings, the cathedrals and courthouses and train stations allegedly built in months by populations that had no plausible means of building them. The buried lower floors of old American cities where windows sit at ground level and staircases descend, from sidewalks into rooms that were once entered at street level. All of this points toward the same conclusion, that the civilization we call America was built on top of a previous civilization, and that the previous civilization had capabilities that the replacement has spent 2 centuries pretending did not exist. But the architectural evidence is only one dimension of what was lost. The medical knowledge was another dimension, arguably the more consequential one, because it affected not the built environment but the living body of every person on the continent. If the civilization that preceded the current American order had a sophisticated pharmaceutical tradition, it would have been encoded the way all practical knowledge gets encoded when a civilization collapses, through practice, through oral transmission, through the hands of the people who kept using what worked even after the institutional structures that had systematized it were gone. The botanical healers of the 18th and 19th centuries, the women called witches and grannies and midwives, the men called herb doctors and root workers, were not inventing their knowledge from scratch. They were carrying forward, in degraded and fragmented form, a pharmacological tradition that had once been organized, written, and formally taught. Samuel Thompson did not invent the use of Lobelia. He received it through a chain of transmission that ran backward through Widow Benton and through the healers she had learned from, to a point of origin that the official history of American medicine has no interest in acknowledging. The Flexner Report, from this perspective, was not merely an educational reform. It was an act of epistemological violence. It declared, with the authority of Rockefeller money and Carnegie prestige, that the only valid medical knowledge was knowledge that had originated in the German laboratory model since approximately 1850. Everything before that date, every tradition that could not trace its lineage to the Pasteur-Koch paradigm, was retroactively declared invalid, primitive, dangerous. The eclectic physicians were not wrong because their methods had been tested and found wanting. They were declared wrong because their methods came from a tradition whose origins were inconvenient, whose knowledge base was decentralized and unownable, and whose continued existence was incompatible with the business model of synthetic pharmaceutical chemistry. Lobelia disappeared from American pharmacies in 1913, but it did not disappear from American bodies. The conditions it had been used to treat did not disappear. Asthma did not disappear. Respiratory obstruction did not disappear. What disappeared was the institutional permission to use the plant that addressed them. What replaced Lobelia were synthetic compounds, patented compounds, compounds that could generate the kind of returns that would fund the research institutions and the medical schools and the journal publications that would in turn generate demand for more synthetic compounds. By the time the post-war generation grew up, the idea that plants could be serious medicine had been so thoroughly degraded in the official culture that even raising it invited mockery. The chronic respiratory conditions that Lobelia addressed were not controlled by the synthetic alternatives in the ways the alternatives manufacturers claimed. Asthma rates in the United States have risen consistently throughout the period in which Lobelia was absent from legitimate medicine. The nicotinic receptor dysregulation that Lobelia was uniquely suited to address became instead the foundation of the tobacco industry's most powerful mechanism of addiction, because Lobelia's structural similarity to nicotine had been known since the early 20th century, and suppressing the one made the other more profitable. The regulatory environment that removed Lobelia from pharmacies made no comparable effort to restrict the product that exploited the same receptor system for profit. What happened to the knowledge itself? It went underground, as it always does. The people who had grown up with it did not forget it overnight. The women in rural communities who had been mixing Lobelia tinctures for their children's croup did not immediately stop because a licensing board in a state capital had decided the plant was dangerous. Knowledge that lives in hands is harder to kill than knowledge that lives in books, because you cannot burn hands. You can discredit the people whose hands hold the knowledge. You can deny them the legal right to share it commercially. You can ensure their children grow up in an educational system that teaches them the knowledge is primitive and wrong. Over 2 or 3 generations, the living transmission frays and thins and finally breaks. That is what happened. Not an immediate erasure, but a generational one, a slow pulling of the thread that by the mid-20th century had unraveled the practical, living tradition that would connected ordinary Americans to a pharmacological heritage going back further than any of the official histories acknowledge. The connection to the older civilization shows up most clearly not in the plants themselves, but in the geographical distribution of the knowledge. The areas of the United States where botanical medicine survived longest are the same areas that show the most persistent evidence of the older architectural and technological heritage. The Appalachian region, the river valleys of the Ohio and Mississippi systems, the transitional zones between the eastern settlements and the great interior. These are the regions where the oldest buildings sit below street level, where the star forts cluster on old maps, where the mound complexes were most densely distributed, where the evidence of the previous civilization is most concentrated, and where the botanical tradition that the Flexner Report most aggressively targeted also concentrated. The healers of the Appalachian tradition were not simply poor rural people making do with what they had. They were the last direct links to a pharmacological tradition rooted in the same civilization whose physical traces the official history has spent 2 centuries burying under grading, renaming and concrete. The people who commissioned the Flexner Report understood that the botanical tradition was dangerous to them in ways that went beyond mere commercial competition. A medical tradition that does not require pharmaceutical supply chains, licensing boards, or academic credentialing is a medical tradition that cannot be controlled. A population that knows how to use the plants growing in the disturbed soils along their roadsides is a population with one less dependency on the institutions through which the post-Tartarian order exercises as its primary mechanism of control, the management of access to things that human bodies need. Samuel Thompson looked beneath the foundation. He did not know what he was looking at, not fully. He knew he had found something that worked, something that had been working for a very long time, something that the academic medicine of his era could not produce or explain. He built a movement around it, and the movement lasted long enough to be systematized by the eclectic physicians, and the eclectic tradition lasted long enough to accumulate a pharmacopoeia that represented genuine knowledge, real healing capacity, real insight into what the plants of this continent could do in a human body. And then the machinery of the replacement civilization rolled over it, as it had rolled over everything else, and the official history was written as though none of it had ever existed. Lobelia inflata still grows in the disturbed soils of eastern North America. It has not been bred out of existence. It still produces lobeline in its tissues, lobeline that still binds to nicotinic receptors, that still modulates dopamine, that still produces bronchodilation and respiratory relief in the ways that generations of healers described. The plant does not know that it was removed from the American Pharmacopoeia in 1913. It does not know that its use was discredited by a report funded by a man whose business interests were served by its discrediting. It grows in the roadside ditches of the same regions where it has always grown, carrying in its chemistry the same information that the widow Benton passed to Samuel Thompson, that Thompson passed to his licensees, that the eclectic physician systematized, and the Flexner Report destroyed. The question the official history cannot answer is not whether lobelia was dangerous. The question is why the standard for removing it was so different from the standard applied to calomel, to bloodletting, to the array of genuinely dangerous interventions that academic medicine was simultaneously defending. The mercury compounds that killed patients were phased out slowly, politely, without the aggressive regulatory action that removed lobelia in 18 months. The difference was not safety, the difference was ownership. Nobody owned lobelia. Everybody could own calomel's successor compounds, could patent them, could control their distribution, could build the institutional apparatus of modern pharmaceutical medicine around them. The plant that could not be owned had to go. That is the real reason. The safety argument is the concrete poured over the dome. What is beneath it, if you push away the official story and look at the fit of the stones, is a simple economic logic dressed up in the language of public health. The civilization that knew how to use lobelia with the specificity that the eclectic pharmacopoeia recorded did not develop that knowledge in the 2 centuries between European contact and the Flexner Report. 2 centuries is not enough time to develop that kind of precision about plant chemistry through empirical observation alone. The knowledge is older than the nation. It is older than the European presence. It came from somewhere, from some period of organized botanical study, from some institutional framework for accumulating and transmitting pharmacological knowledge, that the official history of this continent does not include, because the official history is the history that the replacement civilization wrote for itself beginning in the early 19th century, and it does not include what came before, because what came before was the thing it replaced. The dome is still there, beneath the hill. The machine is still there, in the center of the star. The plant is still there, in the roadside ditch. The knowledge is still there, in the fragments that survived the grinding of the Flexner machine, in the hands of the people who refused to let the living transmission die entirely, in the research of the botanists and pharmacologists who have spent the decades since quietly reconfirming what the eclectic physicians already knew. That lobelia is a real compound with real effects on real human physiology, that the traditional uses of lobelia were not superstition or quackery, but accurate empirical descriptions of what the plant does in the body, and that the removal of lobelia from American medicine in 1913 was not a triumph of safety regulation, but a business decision dressed up as one. The official history says lobelia was dangerous and was rightly regulated out of the American pharmacopoeia. The evidence says lobelia was effective, was rooted in a tradition far older than the nation that banned it, and was removed not because it harmed patients, but because it could not be owned. The civilization that knew this plant most fully is the civilization whose name appears on old maps and in old documents, whose star forts still sit in the disturbed earth of the eastern half of this continent, whose buildings are still standing in every old American city, with their lower floors below the post-catastrophe ground level, whose pharmacological tradition survived in fragments through the botanical healers and the eclectic physicians until the Rockefeller machine finished the job that whatever catastrophe preceded, it had started. The suppression of lobelia in 1913 was not a beginning. It was a completion, a final administrative step in the long project of replacing the old world's knowledge with the new world's product lines. If you have made it to the end of this, you are the kind of person who needs to see the next video in this series, because what we have covered here is only the surface layer. The plant knowledge is connected to the architectural knowledge, and the architectural knowledge is connected to the energy technology, and the energy technology is connected to the monetary system, and all of it connects back to the same point of origin that the replacement civilization has spent 2 centuries covering with concrete and official history and regulatory frameworks that serve the interests of the people who poured the concrete. The next video is on screen right now. Click it. And if you have not subscribed yet, do it before the algorithm buries this where you cannot find it again.